Several ideas or structures that semiotic theorists have defined in pop culture and in traditional human cultures. A very typical structure that you can see is usually the opposition. The opposition between good versus evil, or between hero versus villain. Sometimes male versus female. So sometimes the whole narrative is based on that opposition, right? If we talk about ancient mythology, very often we can see good opposed to the evil. If we talk about modern war movies, it's always the opposition between us and them, between our country and the enemy. So very often the opposition is still the most basic structural element that you can see in the vast majority of narratives. Well, here's where we come across the major problem with semiotics, is that those general structures do not always explain every single narrative. And we'll talk about that later. What do we do with that? A lot of movies have nothing to do with the opposition, right? So how do we explain that? Where is semiotics? We'll talk about that, and there's actually a lot of scholars that worked on trying to find that explanation as well. Mythology, obviously one of the most basic semiotic notions too. Mythology as the basis of pop culture. The major idea here is that mythology is being used in pop culture, and all the mythological plots just keep repeating, and all the mythological oppositions, you can see it as the basis of the modern pop culture. The third basic semiotic notion is representation. That means that cultural works are never directly stating the point. They always represent its meaning through something different. So for example, if you watch a superhero movie and half of the movie is a battle scene between the superhero and the anti-hero, of course that's not the message, right? That's not the message that these guys are just fighting for an hour on the screen. The message here is that it's good to be good and help ordinary people and protect them, and it's not good to be bad. Pretty similar oppositional message. But here, the plot represents an idea that's much more important than all the peculiarities of the plot. So the idea of representation, the way this term is used in this semiotic context, it means that usually plot narratives represent some way more sophisticated encoded message through the narrative. Then we have two more terms, code and textuality. Code, what the code is, that's a system of notions and beliefs that are channeled into representational structures, for example, artwork. So we can say we have a hero code. It's a system of notions and beliefs. A belief that there's a hero somewhere that's ready to sacrifice himself or herself for the greater good of the humanity. And that's already a system of beliefs, right? Because you need to know what's good and what's bad. You need to know what qualities are heroic and which ones are not. So that's already a code, a system of beliefs or values. And those systems can be channeled into those representational structures to communicate a more important encoded message. And the last term, the last basic semiotic notion is textuality. You can see that in a lot of semiotic work. It explores how texts are constructed and how they generate meaning. And then here we also have the term of intertextuality that's related to the last one, to the previous one, and it explores how texts are connected to other texts by allusion, inference, implication, or suggestion. So there's a lot of intertextuality, and a lot of semioticians are trying to interpret pop culture through the idea of intertextuality, through the idea that artwork is connected, and it sort of quotes itself throughout the centuries. All right, moving on to the next one. So what semiotic theories we can talk about here? We have the opposition theory, structuralism, post-structuralism, mythology theory, and code theory. So let's define what they are and take a closer look at all 5 of them. Moving on to the next slide. The first theory, the opposition theory, the idea here is pretty straightforward, that oppositions like night versus day, hero versus evil, hero versus villain, good versus evil, those oppositions are built into the narrative codes of human culture. Again, the problem here is that you can't explain every single piece of artwork, every single film, every single book, just through oppositions, and that's one of the major points of criticism. But it does exist, and it actually explains some of these genres pretty well. Then we have structuralism. Structuralism as a theory sees all forms, words, texts, images, as resulting from oppositional relations within codes. For example, a melody is based on oppositional combinations of tones, rhythms, and harmonies. So, or a poem is based on the opposition of lines that create verses. So structuralism sees pretty much any artwork as a puzzle that you can break down into those structures. And post-structuralism, remember I mentioned before that if you have this part of the word post, it means that this is a new movement that that criticizes the previous one and sort of builds onto it by rejecting some of its basic ideas. Based on this definition, post-structuralism obviously rejects some of the ideas of structuralism. And in this case, post-structuralism rejects those oppositions. So post-structuralist work is usually concentrated on the idea that oppositions are very subjective and culture-specific. So we can't really say, okay, this is good, this is bad, and this is something awesome and this is not, because how do we know? Who decides what's good and what's bad? Isn't it very culture-specific? For example, in some cultures in human history, people wear black clothing to the funeral to communicate that they're grieving. In other cultures, they wear white clothing to the funeral to communicate that they're grieving. So how do you decide what symbolizes what if everything is so culture-specific and subjective? And that's the major point of post-structuralism criticizing using oppositions as the major reference point for analyzing culture. Moving on to the next slide. Mythology theory. As I mentioned, mythology is one of the basic points of semiotic theories trying to analyze culture, and mythology theory is using the idea that pop culture essentially borrowed its oppositions from myths. It works great with characters like Superman or Batman, right? Because we can see a very similar structure in ancient mythology, a superhero that saves the world. But what about other movie genres? It works not so well. Hence, post-structuralism that criticizes this simplicity. Well, I wouldn't say simplicity, but this straightforward sort of interpretation of oppositions as explaining oppositions borrowed from myths as something that can explain the whole modern pop culture. And then we'll move on to the next slide. A couple of theories that we have left in this group, semiotic theories. One of them is the code theory. It's using the idea of representation as an expressive strategy that involves creating a text in a specific context according to a code or set of codes. So what does this whole chain of words mean? It basically means that code theory is using three major reference points: text, context, and code. And we can break down any piece of artwork between these three categories: text, context, and code. One example, we have a comic book about Superman. What would be text here? Well, that's the comic book itself, right? The story, the narrative, the words that the characters are saying, that's your text. It's based on a hero code. So the code for this comic book would be the hero code. And the code, I hope you remember that from the previous slides, that's the set of norms, beliefs, the set of values. So the whole package. And here we have the hero code. The set of values based on the idea that we have this one superhero that's saving humanity, and the superhero usually has some kind of incredible abilities and the tendency to sacrifice himself or herself for the greater good. So that's your hero code. So the text in this comic book would be the narrative of the book. A hero code is the code the comic book is based on. And the context defines how we understand it. So we can have dramatic context, like in the movie The Dark Knight about Batman, very dramatic context. So we interpret all events in a very dramatic context. Then if we talk about Deadpool as a superhero, here we have a very ironic context. This character is always using jokes as a way to deal with the obstacles of life. So it's a totally different context, and it sets a whole new different tone to how we interpret the narrative. So pretty much Again, semiotics works great for movies of this genre because we can break it down between text, code, and context. But it might not necessarily work as well for other movies, especially if we talk about it in independent film production.